Okay, so good morning, one and all. Good to be back. I'm excited to restart our learning. So last we left off, we had completed Sif Gimel in Reish Nun Gimel, and we had talked about there the idea of saving your food that is burning on Shabbos morning. How do you save it so that it doesn't burn all the way, and that you can still have a lunch to go home to after shul. So when we talked about that and putting an empty pot in between, that's an acceptable way to do it. You have to be very careful there, not still at the end, to put it to put it down on the ground. The Shulchan Aruch didn't want you to put it down on the ground. He wanted it to still be boiling. Again, that's really more a matter of, well, you're dealing with a liquid, it sounds like. You're dealing with not so much a solid. A lot of times when we reheat food on Shabbos day, we're talking about a solid, and yet we have to remember sometimes the rules are a little bit different from a solid than a liquid. And here it sounds like there's some liquid involved. The Ramah had though added in at the end of Sif Gimel to the Gvarnis Bar Shenogim Lahakel Afi Misan Al Gabe Karka. This is the minhag is to be already lenient to, even if you did put it down on the ground for a moment, because you're going to put it back anyways. In this situation where you're suddenly putting a barrier between the heat source and the food in order to have it still be warm but not be burning. So that was what we left off. And I also had one question that I had left you guys with, which was we were trying to figure out the whole piece about inside the oven. What was going on with the inside of the oven? I kept saying and going back to, you can't really use the inside of the oven because that's what I had learned. And we came to a point where I don't remember if it was Hinda or someone else had asked the question, which was if we truly treat it like a kira, how come the inside of the oven is, if let's say it's grufo ktuma, you'll say, okay, it's mechzik mevashel, but we had some questions about why we couldn't fully use the inside of the oven in certain circumstances. So I actually asked my Rebbe this question, and he responded back to my email. So I want to read you that response because I want you to have all the information. There was one piece of information that I'm sure I learned this 10, 11 years ago, and I just simply didn't recall this one piece, which makes a difference in terms of the bottom line, the psak halacha. So let me just pull it up. Here we go. Hilchot Shabbat question. So I wrote. So I'll read you the question so that you can understand. You can have that framework in mind for the response. I wrote in my weekly halacha shir. We reached Siman Reish Nun Gimel in Orach Chaim. We've been studying the laws of Chazara. In particular, we discussed the position of the Ran, as quoted by the Rama, that the laws of Chazara, Grufa Ktuma aside, only apply if you remove the food from the kira prior to Shabbos and returning it to the kira after nightfall, right? Remember, that was that whole rule that if it's on during Bein Hashmashos and you take it off, all the rules of Chazara don't apply. So I recall from your shir many years ago that you said that this was the basis of many Jews some years ago placing their food earmarked for Shabbos lunch on the blech prior to Shabbos beginning and leaving it on the blech, leaving it on through Bein Hashmashos. Then people would remove it after place it in the fridge and be able to return it to the blech the next morning. Assuming that I'm recalling that correctly, I have a follow-up question based on what someone in my shir asked. Would it be okay for someone to place the food inside the Shabbos mode oven that has controls deactivated and perhaps even covered over prior to Shabbos and leave it there through Bein Hashmashos, then remove it after Bein Hashmashos and return it into the oven in Shabbos morning to reheat the food? The person asking said that the Shabbos ovens will not regulate the temperature when the oven door opens, and that it randomly regulates itself, though it could still be a problem because you've caused the temperature to go down, and eventually it will regulate because of your action. Let's leave that aside though for this purposes. In particular, so I'm asking about placing it inside because the Mishnah Berurah and Sifkat on Samach Vav makes it clear that he understood this referring to even returning inside an oven, right, inside a kira. So is it true that the very next comment he explains that the Beis Yosef didn't read the Ran this way, but that Mishnah Berurah though, that Samach Hey, that one we talked about, when we talk about the cholent, if you remember, putting the cholent back inside the oven, open the door to reheating food inside an oven. If one can figure out how to ensure that the Havara issue, the fire issue, let's say Shabbos mode, takes away that whole problem of the heat becoming increased when you open the oven, ensuring that that's not violated. So I wrote to him, I said, like, it doesn't seem correct because it appears as if you're cooking at the, but if this Ramah has been relied upon, this would be a possible way to reheat food on Shabbos. It would seem at first glance. So anyway, so this was my email to him. So he responded back. So he said, your reading is correct, but I don't believe that the kula of the Ramah about the ovens applies to our ovens. This is the thing that I didn't recall, that after he wrote this, then it triggered a memory from, again, 10, 11 years ago. He says the reason that is given for their ovens not being tanurim, for their ovens being considered a kiro, is because the Talmudic ovens, the reason that is given for their ovens not being tanurim is because the Talmudic ovens narrowed at the top, and which we talked about, remember, we have the narrow oven at the top, and niklat chumo l'tocho tvei mikira, and so therefore the heat was much more intense than a kira. Right, this other oven, which had it had two openings, it wasn't narrow at the top. So he said, our ovens, he said, practically speaking, as a matter of halacha, our ovens today, right, are sealed and hold their heat far better than anything of theirs. Right, that is indisputable. Right, our ovens are manufactured. You can get them to a temperature that they could have never got. You can put it on self clean, and you get up to 900 degrees when you do that. So our ovens are certainly able to hold in a lot of heat, except that our walls don't hold heat themselves, unlike brick or clay ovens. So once you turn them off, they cool down much faster. But while the oven is on, he said, it is much better in terms of getting the temperature up than their ovens at holding the heat. So therefore, what he's saying, that was all he wrote. What he's saying is that, practically speaking, we treat the inside, not the top or other parts, the inside of an oven today, we treat like the Talmudic tanur, right, which is a much more strict standard where we don't even have any consideration for chazara inside that in a Talmudic tanur, because of the intensity of the heat that can occur inside of the oven. Now, again, I'm assuming that he also has a bit of a Masorah on that, not just, it makes sense. I understand his position, right? That to say that today's ovens, not 100 years ago, by the way, there's something that would have been changed sort of with the manufacturing of ovens. I'm sure over the last 100 years has become much more, I don't know what the word is here, effective, that there's it's much better product. And therefore he's saying that we treat the inside of our modern day ovens like the Talmudic tanur, which would make it very complicated to allow any chazar. Shehiyah is still on the table. There's still, or maybe not, but no, Shehiyah, I think we have to go back. I'm going to go back and just review that. Shehiyah can be done in a tanur. Just there were certain circumstances that had to be met. But anyways, that was the one thing I wanted to share that I know people had asked.
The only question I have is, our ovens, unlike theirs, you control the temperature. So if you set a temperature, the raw temperature will never get high as in there. So therefore, we can compare the two.
So I think that the response to that, Hannah wants to add to it. Go ahead.
And our ovens can be set so low that you can actually put your hand in there and not burn it. My oven has a proof, if you're proofing dough function, which goes to 85 degrees.
Right.
So in the winter, it's enough to keep your food from, freezing cold.
Right.
When you get in, you at least have something moderately warm, and that's not really heating food.
Right. That's an interesting question because it's not even yatzoleted though.
Right.
85 degrees.
I do. I mean, when I proof dough,
right.
I put my hands in there all the time. It's
right.
not a big deal.
So I think that the response to this is the response to this, that again, I could ask him, but a response to this will be that that's something that they could have done too. Meaning you don't have to fuel the fire and underneath the tanur with a lot of wood or coal, whatever it is that the fuel of the fire is. So you could keep the temperature low in theory also in that setting. It's more that this contraption, right, the Talmudic tanur, can reach those temperatures. And so the rabbinic decree is that when we have a structure like that, we avoid chazar. And again, under shahiyah, I remember there were more stringencies. I have to go back honestly to Sif Aleph to just review that. And so I don't know that there's a differentiation between whether you use it at a low heat or a high heat. It's one of these rabbinic zeras where you're talking about this oven, which again, they would have had that option, right? They could have said, if you fuel the fire, now they wouldn't have been talking in degrees probably, but if they could have said, oh, if the Aish is very small, then they could have differentiated, but there is no differentiation that's made in the Gemara for whether there's sort of a large fire or a small fire underneath that oven, and therefore the rule sort of is a blanket rule, which is very common for rabbinic zera. That once there's a rule for this, they don't make exceptions for, if you use it in another way, which makes sense that you maybe should have a leniency, but they don't. That's not. It's not a typical way that Jewish law works. Probably not a secular law, by the way. I'm not sure about that, but I don't know that there's always a cutout for, if you use this particular thing in a safe way, then you're allowed to use it. Maybe in certain things. But so I just wanted to share that information. I wanted to, pass that along. That does, again, it changes the calculation in terms of the inside of the oven. That sort of, to my gut instinct the whole time, which was, I remember walking away from learning Hilchot Shabbat saying, hey, you can't really use it inside of an oven. As we learned this, I was like, wait, but why not? Because if you do treat it like a kira, and again, you can control the heat, the fire in terms of it readjusting, then it does open the door. But if you treat it like the Talmudic tanur, then again, forgive maybe the puns that are happening here, but then you're closing the door to that oven being used as a method of chazara. Okay, questions? If I know maybe I just I threw like a grenade on this whole topic. Okay, let that sink in. If you do think of questions afterwards, please email me. Email is a group. I'm happy we can have maybe I should start a WhatsApp group or something like that. We can always ask questions, during the week if you think of questions. That's not a bad idea, maybe. Okay, so now, but don't worry, I'm going to help you reheat your food. Okay, I will not leave you high and dry. We're going to learn how to reheat the food in a way that's completely fine. That'll be mostly Sif Hey, but we're going to first do Sif Dalet, which discusses once again the idea of hatmana. Hatmana is going to come up here in the context. You'll understand why it's brought here. Let's read it, and we'll see why it's all connected.
I don't know.
Yes.
You saw what I gave you.
Oh yes, Hinda had sent me. I did. I actually have it here on my computer.
They're manufactured this way. They're sold that way.
That's
my
the
notebook, and
gabe,
that's my
the
plation.
kedera gabe kedera.
Yeah.
Now, is that one unit, or you could take them
No,
apart?
you take them apart. You can
Yeah.
use
So
them
look,
separately.
I think that's
It's exactly what we were talking
it's exactly, I didn't know such a thing exists, but the truth is that if you have two pots and they can fit into each other, and it's manufactured that way, you'll see. And when we get to Sif Hey, we'll make reference to Hinda's picture. Maybe I'll even share the screen here for those of you who are tuned in here on Zoom. But apparently, the idea of a kedera agabe kedera blech is not just a Jewish concept. Okay.
Rabbi Hatmana again is what?
So hatmana. So good. Thank you for asking the question, fella. So hatmana is when you have a complete envelopment of a pot, let's say, or in this case, we're going to see it's going to be a kumkum. What's a good word for kumkum in English? It's a
Tea kettle?
Tea kettle. Yeah, thank you. Tea kettle. So you have a tea kettle. So
I lose my words
you
too.
envelop it in a heat source. So if, let's say, the example from the Gemara makes sense if we think about it in the context of composting. Not that I'm one who composts. But if you learn about composting, maybe I should compost. But if you learn about composting, when you take a biodegradable material, right? You take a bunch of scraps of food and you place it into a box, into a sort of a small enclosed area. So you what I understand, the temperature can get quite hot. Is that correct? Inside this, while it's all, doing what it needs to do. I understand. I never stuck my hand in, but my understanding is that it gets very hot. Is that correct? Okay, it gets very hot. So that the Gemara, again, the rabbis of Talmud understood these things in ways that maybe, again, we understand them also, but they lived this. It wasn't, they just observed. Did they fully understand why it was happening? I'm not sure. But if you, let's say, take a pot and you place it into a compost pile, so that's one way, and it's in the middle of it. So that is one way you could retain heat. So if something is done and you go to your backyard and you have a compost pile, I don't know why, I'm not sure why you couldn't think of a better idea, but let's say you put it in there, or you have it on top of an external heat source that is, and then you've enveloped your thing and it's right on top of let's say the coals, right? It's enveloped in a pillow or a blanket or something where it's completely wrapped, then that is called hatmana. And again, we didn't fully yet study the laws of hatmana. It's coming in a few simanim from now. Right, you remember you told me that story, right? So hatmana is is complicated to accomplish in a permissible way. Certainly on Shabbos and Erev Shabbos and the Shabbos, it has to be with a heat source that is not continuously adding heat. Like if let's say you have a fire and it's just continuously adding heat, that's going to be a problem even Erev Shabbos into Shabbos. Again, we will come to these laws soon, but that's just the basic framework of Hatmana. So Yesh Limchos, let's look at Siftal. Yesh Limchos b'yad ha'nogim. Lahat bin mib'od yom kumkum shalmayim chamin v'nosnim osam lisoch hakedera b'Shabbos k'shehatav shel mitzamek. There are those who protest. Yesh Limchos. There are those that protest. Those whose practice is to do hatmana before Shabbos b'od yom with a kumkum shel mayim chamin, with a kettle of hot water, where you want to keep the water hot, so you boil the water before Shabbos, and you want to keep the water very hot. They didn't have in the days of the Shulchan Aruch, they didn't have the thermos with the Shabbos mode and forget even the Shabbos mode. You didn't have the you wanted to. I don't know if they had the fancy bottles that insulated water. I don't think they had such things. So you boil the water, and now you want to keep it hot so that you can use the hot water on Shabbos. Why do you want to do that? To be able to place it into a pot. Go back now to Sif Gimel. We had a burning cholent, let's say. How do you want to save your burning cholent? What's one way you can save your burning cholent without maybe even using the method of putting a pot on top and putting it on top of the pot? One way you can do it is add water. But it's not so simple to add water to a boiling hot chol, to a burning hot chol. Now the water is going to cook, and now you're cooking water. What was that? It's bishul, right? So that's a more serious problem than what we've been talking about. Then you're cooking the water on Shabbos. So one way you could do it is if you have boiling or very hot water, it hasn't cooled down to sort of room temperature. If you use the Ramaz standard or even the Shulchan Aruch standard, if it's very hot, you keep this thing insulated in a very tight space, and you can keep that water very hot for quite some time. Right? Like if you again, nowadays we have these electric thermoses that kind of keep it, the Shabbos mode and everything. But even I remember when I was a kid, we would boil water before Shabbos, and then we placed it into a thermos, not connected to anything, right? And the thermos kept it hot so that if you wanted to have tea or coffee on Shabbos morning or Shabbos afternoon, even it was still hot. So it's essentially that idea here. You want to have boiling hot water so that you can pour it into l'soch hakedera b'Shabbos k'shehatav shel mitzamek. The food is drying out. You want to save the food before it burns. It's drying out. Can I take boiling hot water and pour it in? Now the answer to that question is going to be, yeah, you could actually. But let's read why the Shulchan Aruch was not crazy about it. Again, he's limchos. He's protesting the practice so that people did this. Why did he not like it? It's not because by the letter of the law you couldn't do it. It's that he felt, as you'll see in a moment, that mistakes could be made.
The slippery slope.
The slippery slope argument is here, is rearing its head here. Though I will I will make reference to the Ramah in a moment, who doesn't say more than Va'ayin lekaman siman shin yud ches. All he says is go look at shin yud ches, which is his way of introducing a kula, actually. We'll see this in a moment. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, who gives a very, very, very clear explanation of what's going on here. It's a lengthy comment. Pei Dalet has only one comment on this whole sif, but it's lengthy, but it is very helpful. So what does this mean? Rotze Lomar, the Shulchan Aruch is trying to say, Shemechinen mi ba'od yom. You prepare from on Friday before Shabbos. Mayim chanim. You prepare hot water. Lest I might need it to pour into my cholent that may be dry by the next morning. So I prepare boiling hot water before Shabbos, so I can pour it into a very hot dish. V'das HaShulchan Aruch, the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is limchos bazeh, is to protest this. He doesn't like this practice. De pa'amim echad hayad salet esbo. So here again, the problem is not so much the hatmana, by the way. Hatmana is okay, assuming you do the hatmana properly. Again, we'll talk about how you do hatmana properly. I think it's Rishon and Zion. But let's say you do it properly. What's the problem with the Shulchan Aruch had? He said sometimes, sometimes, one of the items is yad salet esbo. It's very hot. It's above the temperature which would burn your hand if you touched it. But the other one cooled down. Maybe the water is not so hot by the time Shabbos morning gets around. You put it in this thermos. But again, when you're doing hatmana, you can only do it b'davar she'eino mosik hevel. It can't be where it's sort of adding heat if you're doing hatmana. So maybe it's losing steam. So he's going, okay, maybe sometimes it's going to be a problem. When you pour one onto the other, there's going to be cooking involved here. Because if the water gets back down, even if you take water and you boil it and then it cools all the way back down, bishul is still a relevant discussion when it comes to that water if it cooled back down. He says, well, if you look at some of the later commentaries, what they write, what it's going to say, and we get to the simon all about bishul shin yud ches. Well, the Ramah writes over there. He says the anan nohagin kaposkin din lo it's fine legamer, as I've told you many times. If it doesn't fully cool down to room temperature, even when it's a liquid, ainbo bishul, ainbo mishum bishul. There's no topic. There's no conversation about bishul until it fully cools down to room temperature. If it's still warm, right? Then you are not in the category where you can reheat it. No problem. Put it back on the fire assuming you meet the conditions of chazara, not a problem. And if you want to combine it with this other hot water, not a problem. Even if one is not yad saledesbo, and this is a very important comment here. It shows you how low the temperature is of the Ramah, which I think is why it's room temperature. He says, even if you don't have one that's yad saledesbo, which many poskim today estimate, I don't know, 120 degrees yad saledesbo, whatever even if it's not yad saledesbo, but it's still a little hot, right? And therefore, when you pour it together, it's going to heat up above yad saledesbo. As a result of this combination of this mixture, still fine. Gam kein shari, that's permissible. He says that's what everyone does also. People put legumes. I don't know what's the proper pronunciation. I thought it's legumes. Okay, good. Yeah, me too. Some people always say legumes. I don't know. I thought it's legumes. Okay, so you place legumes into a pot. People do this. He says masim b'chol yom. I don't know. I guess in Radin they had legumes. And they would pour on these legumes, which were hot, not maybe boiling. They would pour it this liquid. The liquid that was meat. Rotev shel basar. Okay. V'im kain kevan shakitnios bekli and the kidneys are in a kli right now. Right? They were not where they were cooked. They were placed into a separate dish right now. Va'eru mikli rishon, but apparently this is a dish that they like to have. Legumes with meat sauce. Something like that. Okay. So he says here, Va'eru mikli rishon. So havele bishul. and people are doing this all the time. If you're telling me that this would be a problem, that'd be that it's because they're not. It's not so hot. It's not piping hot. These legumes, they are warm. They're not room temperature. And he says people were pouring the hot, meat sauce right over it all the time on Shabbos. So that would be bishul if you didn't say otherwise. So Ella al korchach, he says it must be the kaven shalom nitztain legamri, says they haven't fully cooled down to what we would call room temperature. Lo shayach bo bishul. There's no such thing as bishul. The efshar shalazeh kiven harama b'masha kasav, and this is perhaps what the Rama was intending when he writes va'ayin lekaman b'simin shin yud ches. It was code word for go look over there. I don't agree with the Shulchan Aruch. He's being too machmir. It's not the chances of you messing up when you're combining these two things is highly unlikely, because the standard is, that it, according to the Rama, it has to fully cool down. It has to be room temperature. Anything above that, you're fine to combine things. So therefore, that's why over there he doesn't talk about anything about any chumrah. He's not machmir, the Rama, about this whole situation. Mikol Makom, Mashma Magen Avram Maskanason. The Magen Avram, in his commentary on the side of the Shulchan Aruch here in this spot, he does say to Af Shein Limchos Bi'Adonogim Lach. Yeah, you shouldn't protest that people are doing this. Okay, people are doing it. It's okay. But Tov Yose Linhog Shlul Aros Arotchem Min Akli Rishon Leka'ara Masha Besocho Ki Im Bekaf. So you know what? Don't pour directly from the Kli Rishon onto these legumes. Take it and put it onto a spoon, because a spoon makes it. If you have a ladle, the ladle is a Kli Sheni, and then the idea of cooking from a Kli Sheni is you're not cooking from a Kli Sheni. You pour from a Kli Rishon, there is potential for some cooking. Pouring from a Kli Sheni, much less potential. There are certain circumstances where it's still a possibility. We will cover that when we get to Shin Yud Ches. But okay, this way you're really being super frum, right? You're making the Shulchan Aruch smile. Okay, v'im hakitnios, im hamarak shebakara nitztan legamri. Now look, if the kitnios do fully cool down, but they are room temperature with its marak, the liquid in which it is cooked. Then for sure you can't pour from a Kli Rishon. It's cooking, because now it's fully cooled down. It's essentially a soup. It's like legumes with it's almost like a cholent. It's like where it's a bunch of beans, but mostly it's a stew. And now you're pouring other things onto this room temperature stew. Now you have a potential for cooking. So ki'im al yedei kaf. Then you have to do it at least through a spoon, because I talk about a Kli Sheni, and then it becomes the whole question: can you be mevashal from a Kli Sheni? And that's a whole question that will get us into a larger discussion about tea and coffee. The practice is to be lenient. I happen to be a little strict about this personally, but I never tell other people to be strict. You have more than one to stand upon if you're going to be lenient on this question. The Rav was lenient about this question. Rav Shechter is lenient about this question. And we will get there. That's also the whole discussion about how can you make tea and coffee. There's a mission about even Kli Sheni sometimes being an issue when it comes to kalei habeshel, things that cook very quickly and easily. Some will claim that tea leaves are in that category because they do cook very quickly, but many are very lenient about this issue. So if your practice is to drink tea and coffee, please continue to drink tea and coffee. Don't start taking on the chumras just because I presented an argument why maybe you should. Okay, but we'll get there. Okay, we'll have a fair treatment of that whole topic. Okay, we're up to Sif Hey. By the way, so you understand now why this was here. This was in response to Sif Gimel as now an alternative to preventing burning. By the way, very practical. So just as a matter of practical halacha, it seems here. Let's say you have a burning cholent on Shabbos morning. Right? You feel your cholent is heading in that direction. It's dried out. There is a way here where you are able to add boiling hot water. Let's say you have not go to the sink and you get the water from the sink. If you have hot water that's already from before, this seems like this is a possibility according to the Rama, the Mishnah Berurah here. Shulchan Aruch doesn't like it. He's limchos. According to the way the Mishnah Berurah read the Rama's little wink wink nod nod comment is that it's okay. You don't have to worry about this because the standard is it's tanin legamre, and that's very you're not going to make a mistake in that kind of scenario. So if you're going to pour some hot water onto your cholent to save it, that seems to be permissible. Okay. Any questions? Okay.
I have to leave.
Okay. So let's just read one line here in the Sifhei, and then I also need to leave. So we'll stop there in a moment. So Sifhei says, and we'll review this. Mutter lasei salpika deras chan. This is going to be really the crux of learning how to reheat the food properly. And you see there are a lot of pages of the Ramah here. So it's permissible to place alpika deras chamin upon a hot pot b'Shabbos tafshil shenizbashal me'erev Shabbos. On top of the pot, to place another dish that was cooked before Shabbos. You're not dealing with cooking here, right? Not cooking this thing on top of the thing. It was cooked cold circle all the way. You go pan dish or panadish. Panadish is imagine a bareka with meat inside of it. Okay, it's like coming with a pocket, and anything like this. That's just an example. L'chaman, why do you want to do it? To heat it up. You want to have it nice and warm for Shabbos lunch. This is not a normal way to cook. You don't usually cook. Now Hinda's going to show us her pot that is made with a double pot on top. I don't know, by the way, it's an interesting question. Is a double pot is a derech bishul because it was made that way. But if you don't have the one that, and I'll show you the pictures later. But let's say you didn't have what Hinda has with this double pot, but it's like pot on top of a pot, right? It's clearly two different things. It's not made for this. That's for sure what we're talking about here. That's not normal to cook in that manner. Maybe the double pot that Hinda has, that is normal to cook because that's how made to do that. To do hatmana, to envelop this under clothing. Let's say you take clothing and you envelop the pot in clothing, and then you put it on top of the heat. You know, the mecham is like a thing of hot water. So it's not this double situation. You have a mecham, that's hot water inside of it. On top of that, you put a pot, but it's covered in clothes. So it's enveloped in clothing because you did hatmana on it. That for sure is awesome. But that's a hatmana problem because hatmana is always problematic on Shabbos or even before Shabbos if it's on top of a heat source. Here it's on top of a heat source because it's all there's a fire underneath all of this. So that's a separate hatmana issue that we're going to talk about. I believe that's all hatmana issue. And we'll stop here. We'll see the Ramah is going to give a whole treatment to this topic. That's going to go for a few pages. So we'll talk about again how to properly reheat our food. The idea of water, these water blechs that are very popular. By the way, some people are not pleased with them, but I think that they make sense. We'll learn, and
It gets so much hotter than anything else.
Right. It's more about the people don't like it because it's like just a little thin layer of water. Some of the rabbis don't like it because it's a thin layer of water, and it seems like you're just circumventing. You really need to have a dish there, something more significant. Then you can put it on top of it. But if it's just water, what's water? But the answer is water is also something you want hot water on Shabbos. So we will see. And I know Rav Hershel Schechter is I remember, I don't know if it was my father-in-law told me this story that he asked him or someone else asked him. Maybe it was my father-in-law asked him. Said to you, what are your thoughts about in a relationship with Rav Shai, his relationship with him? What do you think about about these water? When they came out with these things, they're great. My wife loves it. As a way of saying, yeah, we use it. So there is certainly upon whom to rely upon the water blechs, which are apparently reheat food very nicely. So we'll talk about that. We'll stop here. And we're very close, if I would say, a couple weeks away from really finishing this topic. I would say about 3-4 weeks of more of this, and then we'll move on together. More to talk about in the realm of cooking, and it's not like it's going to be over. There's going to be much more to talk about with food and preparing the fire, and then hatmana we'll talk about, and then we'll get into things like muktzah. So we have a lot of fun topics to cover.